The words hit him like a branding iron pressed flat against his chest. "I do not want your pity." Quinn Overton stood in the doorway of the Harlow County General Store, his hat in his hands, his jaw set hard, and his dark eyes fixed on the woman across the counter, who was doing everything in her considerable power not to look at him. The late afternoon sun sliced through the dusty window and caught the copper in her hair, and he thought, not for the first time, that Georgia Farrow was the most infuriating and the most heartbreaking sight he had ever laid eyes on in all his 31 years on this earth. "I am not offering you pity," he said, and his voice came out lower than he intended, rougher, stripped of the careful distance he had been trying to maintain for months. Georgia's hand stilled on the bolt of fabric she had been folding and refolding since he walked in. Her shoulders were drawn up tight, a posture he had learned to read like weather signs, the kind that came before a storm. There were purple shadows beneath her green eyes and a thin, pale scar along her left jaw that was still new enough to be tender-looking, and the sight of it made something violent and protective twist in his gut. "Then, what are you offering?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet and very controlled, and he could hear every single thing she was refusing to say underneath those 5 words. "You know what I am offering," Quinn said. "A job on your ranch," she said flatly, "out of the kindness of your heart. After everything that has happened, after my father's death, after the fire, after—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "It is charity, Mr. Overton, and I have had enough of people looking at me the way they look at me, and I will not have it from you too." Quinn crossed the floor of the store in 4 strides and placed both hands flat on the counter between them, and she finally looked up at him. And the moment her eyes met, he felt the full force of everything he had been carrying since the night he pulled her out of the burning barn 6 weeks ago. And he understood, suddenly, that the careful, sensible distance he had been trying to maintain was already gone. Had been gone for longer than he wanted to admit. "Good," he said. "Because this is not charity, Georgia. This is not pity. This is—" He stopped himself, pressed his palms harder into the worn wood. "This is something else entirely, and I think you know that too." She stared at him for a long, charged moment, and then she turned away. But she did not say no. That was 6 weeks after the fire, and 8 weeks after she arrived in Harlow County with nothing but a carpetbag, a letter of introduction from a solicitor in Denver, and a dark past that clung to her like smoke clings to clothes long after the flames are gone. It was the spring of 1884 in the New Mexico Territory, a time and place that had very little patience for anything as inconvenient as feelings. The land around Harlow County was wide and bone-dry and beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. And the town itself was a collection of rough-hewn storefronts and hard-scrabble ambitions wedged between a creek and a mesa that turned the color of old blood at sunset. The railroad had come through 2 years prior and had brought with it a cattle market, a telegraph office, 3 saloons, and the particular kind of trouble that follows commerce the way buzzards follow cattle drives. Georgia Farrow had come to Harlow County because she had nowhere else to go. That was the truth she carried, and she carried it the way she carried most hard truths, which was alone and without complaint, and with a composure so complete that most people mistook it for coldness. She was 26 years old, and she had already lost more than most people twice her age. Her mother had died of fever when Georgia was 9. Her older brother Daniel had been killed in a mining accident in Colorado when Georgia was 22. There was also the matter of her time in Denver. Georgia did not speak about her time in Denver. Not to the women at the Harlow County Ladies' Aid Society, who had welcomed her with the particular brittle warmth of people performing Christian charity. Not to Mabel Stokes, who ran the general store and who had offered Georgia work behind the counter within a week of her arrival, and who asked more questions than any person had a right to ask. And certainly not to Quinn Overton, who had been watching her from a careful, respectful distance since the evening she first arrived in town, and who she had been desperately trying not to notice watching her. She knew who Quinn Overton was, of course. Everyone in Harlow County knew who Quinn Overton was. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, 4,000 acres of grazing land running up against the mesa, a headquarters ranch with a main house that had been built to last, and a crew of 12 who had worked for him long enough that they were something closer to family than employees. He had built it himself, or rather, he had built it with his hands and his will and the kind of relentless, focused labor that people talked about the way they talk about forces of nature. He had also, 6 weeks before the conversation in the general store, pulled Georgia out of a burning barn with his own hands at 2 in the morning while the Harlow County Volunteer Fire Brigade was still saddling their horses. She had not asked him to do it. She had been trying to get the 2 horses out by herself, and she had gotten one of them out, and she had gone back for the second, and the second was terrified and refusing to move, and the smoke was already filling her lungs, and the fire was moving faster than anything she had ever seen. And then Quinn Overton had come through the burning door with a wet bandana over his nose and a look on his face that she had not been able to stop thinking about since. He had gotten the horse out, and then he had picked her up off the ground because her legs had given out from the smoke, and he had carried her out into the cold night air. She had regained consciousness with her head on his lap, and his hand in her hair, and the fire roaring behind them, and the whole county gathered at a safe distance watching. And the first thing she had done was push herself upright and move away from him, because even then, even half-conscious and coughing, she had recognized the danger. Not the fire. The man. The barn had belonged to her homestead property. The fire had been set deliberately. Georgia knew this, though she had not told the county sheriff, a slow-moving man named Garrett Phelps who she did not entirely trust. She knew it because she had found the kerosene-soaked rags near the base of the wall 3 days before the fire, and she had moved them, thinking it was a warning. And she knew who had sent the warning, because she had seen the boot print in the mud beside the rags, and she recognized it. She recognized it because she had last seen that boot print on the steps of a Denver boarding house, where a man named Cole Hardwick had stood and told her, very calmly and very pleasantly, that if she ever told anyone what she had seen the night his business partner Martin Voss was killed, he would make sure that she ended up exactly as dead as Martin Voss. The fact that Cole Hardwick had somehow tracked her to Harlow County was a problem Georgia was dealing with alone. It was a dark secret that lived in the basement of her chest and took up most of the room. She was telling herself that she could handle it. She had survived Denver. She had survived her father's catastrophic selfishness. She had survived the fire. She could survive Cole Hardwick. What she was not entirely sure she could survive was Quinn Overton. The morning after their confrontation in the general store, she arrived at work to find a paper-wrapped parcel on the counter with her name written on it in a confident, angular hand. Inside was a pair of leather work gloves, good ones, the kind that would last years, and a note that said simply, "The north fence on my property needs mending. The job pays $12 a month, room and board included, no charity involved. The fence genuinely needs mending. Q. Overton." Georgia read the note 3 times. She put the gloves on. She took them off. She folded the note carefully and put it in her apron pocket and spent the rest of the morning pretending she was not thinking about it. Mabel Stokes watched all of this from behind a crate of dry goods with an expression of elaborate innocence. "You know," Mabel said, "at noon, when there were no customers in the store. Quinn Overton has not gone looking for help to mend his north fence in the 7 years I have known him. I am sure the fence will be fine without me, Georgia said. The fence, Mabel said with considerable emphasis, has never been the point. Mrs. Stokes, he pulled you out of a fire, Georgia, I am aware. He has ridden past this store every day for 6 weeks. Georgia turned to look at Mabel with the full force of her composure, which was considerable. With respect, Mrs. Stokes, I am not in the market for whatever you are suggesting. Nobody is ever in the market for it, Mabel said pleasantly. That is the entire problem. Georgia thought about the note in her apron pocket all afternoon. She thought about the bootprint in the Denver mud and the kerosene-soaked rags, and the particular cold smile on Cole Hardwick's face. She thought about the way Quinn Overton had looked at her across the counter of the general store. Not with pity, not with the careful sympathy of a man performing good works, but with something that was direct and warm and entirely honest, as if he had simply decided to stop pretending. She thought about the fact that she was sleeping in a single rented room above the hardware store, with $32 to her name and a man from her past who had already set her barn on fire, and that every logical, practical instinct she possessed was telling her that being on a working ranch, surrounded by people, with steady income, was the safest possible position she could put herself in. She told herself it was purely logical. She told herself this very firmly. She rode out to the Overton ranch the following morning. Quinn Overton was in the yard when she arrived, talking to a broad-shouldered man with a sun-weathered face, who she would later learn was his foreman, a steady, quietly competent man named Edgar Rue. Quinn heard her horse and turned, and the look on his face when he saw her, fast and unguarded and then quickly controlled, told her more than she wanted to know and also more than she was willing to admit that she needed to hear. "Miss Farrow," he said. "Mr. Overton," she said. "I have come about the fence," he nodded. He did not smile. He was good at that, she would discover, not performing, not making shows of things. He simply said, "Edgar will show you where we keep the supplies," and went back to what he was doing, and she understood somehow that this restraint was a form of respect, and she filed it away carefully in the part of her that was still learning to trust anything at all. The ranch was called the Mesa Quarter, and it ran to the northeast of Harlow County along the base of the Red Mesa that gave the county its particular sundown drama. The main house was solid and square built, with a wide porch and a stone fireplace and windows that someone had hung curtains in, which surprised her. There was a bunkhouse for the crew, a cookhouse, a barn that was newer than the rest of the buildings, and a kitchen garden behind the main house that was being tended with more care than she expected. She was given a small room at the end of the main house, separate from the bunkhouse, which she understood was an arrangement designed to protect her reputation as much as her privacy. She unpacked her carpetbag, which did not take long, and she looked out the window at the Red Mesa against the blue sky, and she felt something loosen very slightly in her chest that had been pulled tight for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like. That night she ate supper with the crew in the cookhouse, which was the custom on the Mesa Quarter. Quinn ate with his men, not apart from them, and she noted this too. He sat at the far end of the long table and did not make her feel observed, though she was aware of him with an accuracy that was inconvenient. The crew was made up of 12 men ranging from early 20s to pushing 60, and they received her with the particular careful courtesy of men who had been told by their employer to treat the new hire with respect. She was grateful for it. She had been prepared for something harder. "You rode out here alone," Edgar said to her after supper, while she was helping carry plates to the wash basin, which was apparently not the custom but which she did because she was not accustomed to sitting idle. "I did," she said. "That road is not entirely safe after dark," he said, not unkindly. "I arrived before dark," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Right enough," he said. Then, "Mr. Overton mentioned you might want to familiarize yourself with the whole of the property. The north fence can wait a day or two. He said to give you time to settle." She understood this was Quinn's way of not pressing her, and she felt that loosening in her chest again, and she did not know what to do with it, so she simply said thank you and went to bed. She lay awake for an hour listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, which were different from the sounds of the town, bigger and quieter simultaneously. The wind against the mesa and the horses shifting in the barn, and the vast, indifferent dark of the New Mexico sky pressing down on everything. She thought about Cole Hardwick. She thought about the night Martin Voss died. She had been working in Denver as a bookkeeper for a trading company, a respectable position she had secured through the solicitor who had helped settle her father's estate. The trading company occupied the ground floor of a building in the commercial district, and Cole Hardwick was one of its silent investors, a man who appeared occasionally in her employer's office, and who regarded everyone in the room as something to be weighed and valued and possibly used. She had not liked him from the beginning. She had a sharp instinct for people, and Hardwick had the kind of smooth, pleasant surface that was pulled too tight, the kind you learned to recognize if you grew up around someone like her father. The night it happened, she had gone back to the office after hours because she had left her account books, and she had heard voices in the back room, and she had stopped because something about the sound of them was wrong. And then there had been a single gunshot, and a sound she did not want to remember, and then silence, and then Hardwick's voice, very calm, saying something she could not entirely hear. She had gotten out. She had not been seen, or she had thought she had not been seen. She had taken the account books, and she had walked back to her boarding house, and she had spent the entire night sitting on her bed fully dressed, trying to decide what to do. By morning, she had decided to go to the authorities. She had dressed. She had put her hand on the door of her room and found a note that had been slipped under it during the night, and the note had told her exactly what would happen to her if she did. And the note had been signed with a small, perfect drawing of Hardwick's ring, which was a particular ring with a red stone that she had noticed on his hand, and that she would have recognized anywhere. She had left Denver instead. She had not stopped feeling like she was running since. The thing that no one in Harlow County knew, the thing she had told no one, was that before she left Denver, she had done one thing. She had taken the account books home with her, and she had copied in her clear, trained bookkeeper's hand every irregularity, every false entry, every record of transaction that did not match the company's stated business. She had copied it all into a small leather notebook, and she had mailed that notebook to a Denver attorney she had looked up in the directory, a man named Harold Bell who had a reputation for honest dealing, with a letter explaining what she had witnessed and instructions to hold the notebook until he heard from her again. The notebook was her only leverage. It was also the reason Hardwick had found her and followed her here. She had not yet decided what to do about it. She fell asleep finally as the eastern sky began to lighten, and she dreamed of Quinn Overton's hands flat on the counter between them, and his voice saying, "This is something else entirely." And she woke up warm and confused and more frightened than she had been when she went to sleep. Over the next 2 weeks, she learned the rhythm of the Mesa Quarter, and it was a good rhythm, the kind that had been built by someone who understood both land and people. Quinn ran his operation with a directness that she found herself admiring against her best intentions. He made decisions quickly and explained his reasoning when explanation was warranted. He treated his crew as partners in the work rather than instruments of it. He kept the books himself, which she noticed immediately, and which told her something about how he had built what he had. She began mending the north fence, and it was genuine work, genuinely needed. Miles of cedar post and wire running along the property edge, sections rotted or broken or taken down by weather, and she worked systematically from the southwest corner, replacing posts and tightening wire with a methodical efficiency that she could see surprised people, and which she found she did not mind them being surprised by. Quinn rode the fence line with her on the third day, not to supervise, just to ride. They went most of the morning without speaking more than was necessary for the work, and she found that his silence was comfortable in a way she had not anticipated. Not the silence of a man waiting for something, but the silence of a man who was genuinely satisfied to be where he was. "You did not hire someone local," she said eventually, when they stopped to water the horses at a creek that cut through the northeast corner of the property. "For the fence," he said. "For any of it. You have had openings in the crew since winter." Mabel Stokes is a comprehensive source of information. The corner of his mouth moved. Mabel is a comprehensive source of everything. You had 2 men leave in January and you have not replaced them. "I was particular about who I wanted," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back at her steadily, and the thing between them that she was refusing to name pressed itself against the inside of her sternum. "Mr. Overton. Quinn," he said. "Everybody calls me Quinn." "I think it is better if I am clear with you," she said. "I think it is better if you are," he agreed, and there was no irony in it, just honesty. "I am grateful for the position. It is practical and I intend to do the work well. But she paused. "I am not in a position to offer anything beyond that. I came here because the situation is difficult, and I needed steady work and safety in numbers and—" "Safety in numbers," he said, and his voice changed. She had said more than she intended. She picked up her horse's reins. "Georgia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice did something entirely unfair to her equilibrium. "Are you in danger?" "I can manage my own affairs," she said. "I have no doubt," he said. "That was not what I asked." She looked at him for a long moment. He sat his horse the way men who have spent their lives on horseback sit them, easy and natural and with their full attention on her, and his dark eyes were direct and serious and entirely without the thing she feared most, which was pity. "Probably not imminently," she said at last, which was more than she meant to give him. He nodded, accepted it, did not push further. They rode back to the ranch in the same comfortable silence as before, except that something had shifted in it, something that she could feel in the air between them like a change in pressure before rain. That evening she wrote a letter to Harold Bell in Denver, asking him to confirm that the notebook was still in his possession. She did not know if Cole Hardwick had gotten to Bell, and she needed to know. 3 days later, a rider came through from Harlow County with the mail, and there was a letter addressed to her in a hand she did not recognize. She opened it carefully and found 2 lines. "The item is safe. Be careful of a man asking questions." It was signed with an H. The item was safe. Hardwick had not gotten to Bell yet, but he was asking questions, which meant he was closer than she had realized. That evening at supper she was quieter than usual, and she knew that Quinn noticed, because he was the kind of man who noticed everything without advertising the fact. After the crew had cleared out and she was carrying the last of the dishes to the basin, he came into the cookhouse and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and stood leaning against the counter. "Bad news?" he asked. "News," she said. "I am still deciding if it is bad." He drank his coffee. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch were beginning. Somewhere Pete Cassidy was playing a harmonica badly. "Tell me something about yourself," Georgia said suddenly, because she realized she had been cataloging everything about him for 2 weeks, and the inventory was entirely one-sided. He looked slightly startled, which she found unexpectedly charming. "What do you want to know? How did you come to be here? This land, this operation, it is not a small thing." He considered the question seriously, the way she had noticed he considered most things. "I came out from Missouri in 1875, he said. "I was 22. I had $40 and a horse that wasn't entirely mine." "Not entirely yours. I had borrowed it from my uncle without fully explaining my intentions," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved again. "I paid him back eventually, with considerable interest." She found herself almost smiling. "And the land?" "I worked for a cattle operation in Texas for 3 years, saved everything I made, came here in '78 when the territory started opening up, bought the first 500 acres with what I had, built the rest from there." He said it plainly, without pride or false modesty. "It was hard going for the first few years. There was drought and there were men who did not want competition, and there were years when I was not certain it was going to hold. But it held," she said. "It held," he agreed. She looked at him across the cookhouse in the lamplight, and she thought about what it took to build something from $40 and a borrowed horse over 9 years in this particular country. And she felt something that was not pity and was not admiration exactly, but was something deeper and quieter than either. "Why are you not married?" she asked, and then immediately wished she hadn't. He looked at her directly. "I was waiting," he said, "for the right reason." The silence that followed that sentence was enormous. She turned back to the dishes. "Georgia," he said. "Good night, Mr. Overton," she said. "Quinn," he said. She stopped at the door, did not turn around. "Good night, Quinn," she said quietly. She heard him exhale. The next morning she found fresh lumber stacked beside the section of fence she was working on, which she had not asked for and which was twice as much as she would have thought to order. And she understood that he was telling her something without saying it, that he was thinking ahead, that he saw her as someone who would be here long enough to use it. The fact that this made her feel warm and also terrified in equal measure was something she chose to simply live with. The following week changed everything. It was a Thursday. She remembered that specifically, because Thursday was when the supply wagon went into town, and she had sent a list with Thomas Birch of a few items she needed. And Thomas had come back not just with her items, but with a message from Mabel Stokes, saying that a stranger had come into the general store asking after a woman named Georgia Farrow. She read the message twice, and then she folded it into her apron pocket with the same careful composure with which she did everything. And she sat down on the fence post she had just placed, and she let herself be frightened for exactly 60 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself for things of this nature. Hardwick was in Harlow County. She had known he was coming. She had known since Belle's letter. But knowing and having it arrive were 2 different categories of experience. She had a decision to make. She could continue to run. She had been running since Denver, and she was very good at it. And the problem was that she was tired of it in a way that went past bone deep. She was tired of the carpet bag, and the single room, and the way she had to constantly calculate the cost of trusting anyone. She was tired of being alone with the weight of what she knew about the night Martin Voss died, or she could stop running. She sat on the fence post for a long moment looking out at the red mesa in the afternoon light. Then she went to find Quinn. He was in the barn, working on a harness. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted immediately at whatever he read in her face. "Sit down," he said, and pulled over a stool without waiting for her to agree, and she sat, and then she told him everything. About Denver, about Hardwick. about the night of the shooting, about the notebook, about the fire at her barn, about Belle's letter. She told him all of it in a steady, quiet voice, and she kept her eyes on the barn floor while she talked, because she found it easier to speak clearly when she was not looking at him, and she finished and the barn was very quiet. "He set fire to your barn," Quinn said. "Yes, to warn you." "Yes, and you came here, because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "And because I thought that more people around me would make it harder for him. I was not." She stopped. "I was not using you, Quinn, not specifically, but I was calculating, and I think you should know that." He was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me now?" She looked up at him. "Because he is in town, and because—" She stopped again. "This was harder. Because you have been honest with me, and I have not been entirely honest with you, and I find that I cannot." She pressed her lips together. "I find that I cannot continue to accept your honesty while withholding my own." He looked at her for a long, still moment. "You are going to fight him," he said, and it was not a question. "I have evidence of what he did," she said, "if I can get to the right authority. A United States Marshal, not a local sheriff who Hardwick can get to. If I can get a message to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe." "I have a contact in the marshal's office in Santa Fe," Quinn said simply. "Edgar's brother is a deputy." She stared at him. Something about the fact that he had immediately gone to how to help rather than telling her what she should have done differently made her chest ache with a force that she was not prepared for. "I am going to handle it myself," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I am just saying that I know a man in Santa Fe." She looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light came through the barn door and caught the angles of his face, and he was looking at her with that direct, steady attention that had been undoing her careful composure for weeks. And she thought about all the people she had lost, and all the times she had made the calculation that trust was too costly and come up with the same answer. And she thought about $40 and a borrowed horse and 9 years and something that held. "All right," she said. "Tell me about Edgar's brother." His name was Samuel Rue, and he was a deputy United States Marshal based out of Santa Fe, and Edgar dispatched a wire to him that evening from the Harlow County Telegraph Office. Quinn wrote the wire himself, in terms he said were specific enough to get attention without tipping their hand, and Georgia read it over his shoulder and felt the strange, groundless sensation of having someone else involved in a problem that she had been carrying alone for so long. They waited. Hardwick was in town, and Quinn posted 2 of his men to keep a quiet eye on the situation. Not to confront anyone, just to observe. He explained this to Georgia not as a decision he had made for her, but as a proposal he was making to her, saying this is what I would suggest, and leaving it entirely up to her. And she said yes, because it was sensible, and because she was trying to practice something that did not come naturally to her, which was allowing other people to help. While they waited, the ranch went on as ranches do, which is to say with an enormous and constant amount of work. Georgia finished the north fence section and began on the east, and she helped with the spring inventory. And she discovered that she had opinions about the way the feed accounts were being kept that she expressed to Quinn one evening after supper, carefully, and with full awareness that it was not strictly her business. He listened to the whole thing and then said, "You kept books professionally, for 2 years in Denver. I have been doing them myself." "I know," she said. "There are several things I would do differently." He slid the account book across the table to her, just like that. "I am not taking your books just because I offered an opinion," she said. "You are not taking them," he said. "I am asking you to look at them and tell me where I am wrong. I have no pride about bookkeeping." She looked at them. She found 3 things she would do differently and 1 thing that was genuinely a problem in his tracking of credit accounts. and she told him all of it plainly. And he listened to all of it and made notes. And by the time they were done, the lamp had burned low, and it was later than she had realized. "I am keeping you up," she said, starting to rise. "No," he said quickly, and then, "Stay a minute." She sat back down. He was looking at the account book, not at her. "I want to say something, and I want to say it once, and then I will not bring it up again unless you want me to." The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind had come up and was pushing against the windows. "I am not asking anything of you," he said. "I know what your situation is, and I know why you are here, and I know you are frightened, though you will not say so. I am not going to add to the weight of that." He looked up at her finally. "But I want you to know what this is. For me, in case it matters, in case it is useful information." She waited. "This is love," he said. "That is what I am offering you, not pity, not charity, not a shelter because I feel sorry for your circumstances. I want you here because every day you are here I am." He stopped, started again. "I have never built anything as slowly and carefully as I have built this ranch, and I have never wanted anything with as much patience and certainty as I want a life with you. And I know that is a great deal to put in front of a person, and I know the timing is terrible, and I know you came here running from something and not toward me." He paused. "But I thought you should know." Georgia sat very still. The lamp burned. The wind pressed against the window. "Quinn," she said finally, and her voice was not as steady as she would have liked. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I know," she said, "but I want to." She looked at her hands on the table. "I am not going to tell you that I have not noticed, because I think you know that I have. And I am not going to tell you that I am," she paused, "that I feel nothing, because I think you know that would not be the truth either." She looked up at him. "But I am frightened, Quinn, and not just of Hardwick. I am frightened of trusting something that might be taken from me. I have had," her voice got tighter, "I have had everything I trusted taken, my mother, my brother, the life I thought my family would have, and I built something in Denver, something small, something that was just mine, and it was taken too, and I do not think I can." She stopped completely. "I know," he said quietly, "I know." "How can you know?" "Because the first winter out here, the winter of 1879, I lost everything I had built up to that point," he said. "Cattle freeze. The well went dry. One of my men died of exposure on a fence run, and I could not bring him back to his family because the snow was too deep." His jaw tightened. "I know what it is to lose something you built, and I know what it costs to start building again." She looked at him and felt the full weight of what he had just offered her, not comfort, not reassurance, just the truth of knowing. "Give me time," she said. "All you need," he said. Samuel Rue arrived from Santa Fe 4 days later, riding a government horse and carrying credentials that made Sheriff Garrett Phelps straighten up considerably in his chair. He was a quieter, more contained version of his brother Edgar, and he sat in Quinn's kitchen the evening of his arrival and listened to Georgia's account of the Voss shooting with a focused attention that told her he was taking it seriously. "You have the notebook," he said. "In Denver with Harold Bell." "Bell is solid," Samuel said to her surprise. "I know him, have worked with him on previous matters. I can wire him tonight." "Hardwick is in town," Quinn said. "I know," Samuel said. "I have been watching him since the county line." He looked at Georgia. "He has been asking questions about you, Miss Farrow, careful questions. He has not made any threatening move yet, which tells me he is trying to determine whether you have talked to anyone." "She has now," Quinn said. "She has," Samuel agreed and looked at Georgia again. "I need your account in a signed affidavit, Miss Farrow. I have the authority to arrest Hardwick on suspicion with what you have given me verbally, but the affidavit and the notebook will make the charges hold." "Then you have it," she said. She sat at Quinn's table, and she wrote out her affidavit in her clear bookkeeper's hand. 3 pages of it. Every detail she remembered, from the night of the shooting to Hardwick's note to the kerosene-soaked rags to Belle's letter, and she signed it with her full name. And when she was done, her hand was trembling slightly from the sustained effort of remembering things she had worked for a year and a half not to think about. Quinn put a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked. She wrapped both hands around it and was grateful. Samuel rode back into town that evening to wire Belle and to begin the formal process of arrest. He told Georgia to stay on the ranch and to keep close company. The night was quiet, but it was a tense quiet, the kind where every sound sharpens. Around midnight, one of Quinn's men who had been watching the road came back at a hard trot to say that Hardwick had left the hotel in Harlow County and was heading east, which was the direction of the Mesa Quarter. Quinn was on his feet before the man finished speaking. He turned to Georgia, and his face was calm and his voice was even, and she could see the control it cost him. "I need you to go to the back room," he said. "Take the rifle from over the fireplace and the box of shells on the second shelf. If anyone comes through that back door who is not one of my men, you shoot. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. "You know how to use a rifle. My brother taught me," she said. He looked at her for 1 second, and his hand came up and touched her face, just her jaw, just briefly, and then he was out the door. She got the rifle and the shells, and she went to the back room, and she sat in the dark with the rifle across her lap, and she listened. What followed was not the dramatic, violent confrontation she had feared. Samuel Rue met Hardwick on the road a quarter-mile from the ranch, having ridden out to intercept him. And Hardwick, faced with a United States Marshal and a warrant, made the decision that men who have always operated through intimidation and distance, rather than personal violence, usually make, which was to surrender. He was arrested. He was taken to the county jail, and the federal hold was filed before dawn. Georgia sat in the back room of Quinn's house for 40 minutes before Quinn came back and knocked on the door and said, "It is over. He is in custody." She opened the door. He stood in the hallway, wind-messed and fully awake, and the relief in his face when he saw her was so open that she felt it in her own chest. "All right," he said. She nodded. She set the rifle carefully against the wall. Her hands were trembling again, she noticed distantly, and Quinn noticed too, and he crossed the hallway and took both her hands in his very gently and held them until they stopped. She let him. She stood in the hallway of his house in the deep of the night with her hands held in his, and she breathed. And the enormous weight she had been carrying since a night in Denver, a year and a half ago, loosened and shifted, and she felt the exhaustion of it all the way down to her feet. "Quinn," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not finished yet," she said. "I still have to testify, and there will be proceedings in Denver probably, and—" "I know," he said again. "And I am," she looked up at him. "I am not easy, I know that. I am not the kind of person who—" she struggled for the words. "I do not accept help easily, and I am slow to trust, and I carry things too long by myself, and I am aware of these things, but I have not fixed them." "I am not looking for easy," Quinn said quietly. "I am looking for you." She looked at him in the lamplight of his hallway at some dark hour of a New Mexico morning, and she thought about what he had said 4 days ago at the kitchen table, and all the careful, patient honesty of the weeks before it, and the gloves in the paper-wrapped parcel, and the lumber stacked beside the fence section. And she thought about $40 and a borrowed horse, and she said, "I think I am already in love with you. I think I have been for some time. I was just afraid to look directly at it." He stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "There it is," and she laughed. For the first time in she could not remember how long, she laughed, and it came out slightly unsteady and entirely real. And he smiled at her with his whole face, the first time she had seen him smile that way, and it was something she knew immediately she would spend a long time trying to protect. He did not kiss her that night. She understood why, and she was grateful for it, because she was worn through and the night had been too large, and he was not a man who moved before something was ready. He walked her to her room and he said good night, and she closed the door and sat on her bed and felt the strange, fragile, terrifying, luminous condition of someone who has decided to stop running toward something instead. The weeks that followed were complicated in the practical sense and extraordinary in every other. Harold Bell sent the notebook to Samuel Rue, and its contents, combined with George's affidavit, were more than sufficient. Cole Hardwick was charged with the murder of Martin Voss and extortion, and the arson of George's barn, and he was transported to Denver to stand federal trial. And Georgia learned all of this through letters from Samuel Rue, who was thorough and kept her informed at every stage. She was asked to travel to Denver to provide testimony at the trial, and she knew she would have to go, and she was preparing herself for it. But the practical complications, the correspondence and the legal proceedings and the preparations for the trip to Denver, existed in a completely different register from everything else that was happening, which was the slow, deliberate, deeply attentive unfolding of something between her and Quinn that was unlike anything she had ever known. He courted her. There was no other word for it, and it was not a word she would have expected to apply to any experience of her own, but he courted her with the same patience and intention he applied to everything, and it was the most quietly devastating process she had ever undergone. He rode out with her in the evenings along the Mesa base, and they talked about everything, about his years in Missouri and her years following her father's disasters from town to town, and her brother Daniel, who she had loved so much and missed so continuously, and who she found she could talk about now without the carefully managed grief becoming unmanageable. He told her about the man who died in the winter of 1879. His name had been Edward Marsh, and she understood what it cost Quinn to say the name out loud. She told him about her 2 years in Denver and what it had been like to make something for herself and have it destroyed. He brought her a book one evening, a novel she had mentioned in passing as something she had loved when she was young, and she did not ask how he had gotten it because Harlow County had no bookstore, and she chose to simply receive it as what it was. She helped him with the accounts, officially now, a proper arrangement with proper pay that Edgar had carefully not commented on except to say that the books had never been better. She was good at it, and being good at something in a place where the work mattered settled something in her that had been unsettled for years. There was a Sunday in late April, 3 weeks after Hardwick's arrest, when the whole of the Mesa Quarter crew and most of the neighboring homesteaders gathered for a spring range inspection and an informal meal afterward, because Quinn believed in the kind of community that meant your neighbors knew your land and you knew theirs. Georgia helped Rosie Birch, Thomas's aunt who cooked for the cookhouse, prepare the meal, and there were children running between the horses and the men talking cattle and the mesa standing above all of it in the afternoon light. And Georgia stood for a moment in the yard between the cookhouse and the main house and felt something she was almost afraid to name. She named it anyway. She named it home. Quinn found her there and stood beside her, and they watched the comfortable chaos of the afternoon together, and his shoulder was touching hers and neither of them moved away. "I need to go to Denver," she said. "I know," he said. "When does Samuel Rue need you? The trial begins in 6 weeks. "I will take you," he said. "Quinn, Georgia," he said quietly, "let me." She thought about all the times she had said she did not need help, and all the ways she had been right about being capable of managing alone, and all the ways that being right about it had been cold comfort. She thought about the fact that letting someone stand beside you was not the same as needing them to carry you. "All right," she said, "but I am paying my own passage." He looked at her. There was something warm and exasperated and entirely fond in his expression. "That is not a fight I am going to win, is it?" "No," she said. "All right," he said. It was on the evening before they left for Denver that he finally kissed her, and it was so perfectly characteristic of him that she was almost ready for it. They had been on the porch after supper, watching the last of the day drain out of the sky, and she had turned to say something to him and found him already looking at her, and she said, "Oh," very softly, and he said, "Yes," and then he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been certain for some time and was simply waiting for the right moment. And it was slow and careful and complete. And when it was over, she stood in the dark with her hand against his chest, feeling his heart beat. And she thought with sudden clarity that this was the thing she had been most afraid of. Not Hardwick, not the trial, this, because this mattered. Because this was the kind of thing that, if lost, would not leave a space that could be filled with anything else. She told him this. He listened to all of it with his hand over hers against his chest. Then he said, "Then we will not lose it." "You cannot promise that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I cannot promise it. I can only tell you what I intend." He looked at her. "I intend to be here. I intend to choose this every day. I intend to be the kind of man you never have to run from. And I know that you knowing my intentions does not remove the risk. But it is what I have to offer, and I am offering it." She stayed on the porch for a long time after she went back inside, listening to the wind and the dark and thinking about trust, not as a calculation but as a choice. A daily choice. The way building something from $40 and a borrowed horse was a daily choice for 9 years. She thought she could make that choice. The journey to Denver was 5 days by stagecoach and train, because the rail line only ran as far north as Albuquerque, and they took a coach the rest of the way. And it was a journey that would have been arduous alone, but was something else entirely with Quinn beside her. He was a good traveler, unhurried and observant, and he pointed out things she had not noticed about the landscape, and he listened to her talk about the geology of the Mesa country, which she had been reading about because it interested her, with the focused attention of a man who finds the enthusiasms of the person he loves genuinely interesting rather than something to be tolerated. He asked about her brother Daniel. She told him more than she had told anyone, about the particular quality of Daniel's laugh, and the way he had taught her to shoot, and the way he had believed in her capacity to do anything she set her mind to with a conviction that had buoyed her for years after his death. "He sounds like someone I would have liked," Quinn said. "He would have liked you," she said, and was surprised to find that she was sure of it. Denver was harder than she had anticipated. Not the city itself, though it had grown considerably since she left, and the sight of the commercial district brought a sharp and complicated feeling. The hard part was walking back through what had happened, slowly and in legal detail, in front of a courtroom. She had prepared herself for it, and she was composed and clear, and she told her account completely. And Hardwick sat across the room with his attorney and watched her with his cold, pleasant expression, and she met his gaze every time and held it. Quinn sat in the gallery. She did not look at him during the testimony, because she knew if she looked at him, she might lose the edge of detachment she needed. But she knew he was there with the same accuracy with which she had always known where he was, and it was enough. The jury deliberated for a single afternoon. Cole Hardwick was convicted of the murder of Martin Voss and sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. The extortion and arson charges added years to the sentence. He would not see the outside of a prison until he was old, if he saw it at all. Georgia sat in the courthouse corridor afterward and breathed very carefully and let the shaking in her hands run its course. Quinn sat beside her and said nothing until the shaking stopped, and then he said, "It is done." "It is done," she agreed. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. She thought about it. "I want to eat dinner somewhere that has good food," she said, "and I want to sleep in a real bed, and tomorrow I want to go home." He took her hand, squeezed it once. "Then that is what we will do," he said. "We should come back," she said, looking at the notices. "Later, when there is a full performance." "We should," he agreed, and the ease of the we, the simple, unadorned assumption of a future with her in it, sat in her chest like a warm coal. On the train south, sitting in the coach car with the Colorado landscape going gold and brown outside the window and Quinn's shoulder warm against hers, she said, "I want to talk about what happens when we get back." "All right," he said. "I want to keep the work," she said. "The accounts." "The fence, I want to be," she paused. "I want to be useful, I do not want to be kept." "You are useful," he said mildly, as if this were entirely obvious. "I want to be clear about what I am building," she said. He turned to look at her. "What are you building?" "I do not entirely know yet," she said. "But I know I am not building dependence. I know I am not building something where I stop being." She searched for the word. "Myself." "Georgia," he said, with the patience of a man who has been extremely patient for a long time. "When have I asked you to stop being yourself?" She thought about it. She thought about the note about the fence, and the gloves, and the account book slid across the table, and the way he presented his opinions as proposals, and his decisions as suggestions, and his love as information, given once, without demand. "Never," she said. "That is not going to change," he said. She looked out the window at the passing landscape. "I want to marry you," she said to the window. Quinn was very still for a moment. "I know," she continued. "That is customarily the other party's line. And I know I am saying it before you have asked, and I know, Georgia," he said. "I know that is not the conventional order of things, Georgia," he said again. She turned to look at him. "I have been carrying a ring in my coat pocket since before we left for Denver," he said. She stared at him. "I was trying to determine the correct moment," he said, "and I have clearly been outmaneuvered." She started laughing again, the same unsteady, entirely real laugh of the night after Hardwick's arrest, and he reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that was simple and gold with a small garnet stone in a plain setting, and she took a breath. "That is the ring from the jeweler on Columbine Street in Denver," she said. "We walked past it twice," he said. "You looked at it both times." "I did not know you noticed," she said. "I notice everything," he said, "where you are concerned." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Put it on," she said. He took her left hand very carefully, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly because of course it did. Because he had found a way to know her ring size without asking. Probably by describing her hand to the jeweler the way a man who notices everything would describe such things, with complete accuracy. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That was a yes 10 minutes ago when I proposed to you," she said, and he laughed, and it was the best sound she had heard in years. They returned to the Mesa quarter in May, arriving back in Harlow County on a bright, cool afternoon when the mesquite was in flower, and the light on the mesa was a warm, deep orange, and Edgar met them at the rail of the yard with an expression of studied nonchalance that cracked immediately when he saw George's hand. He looked at Quinn. "About time," he said. Quinn looked at Georgia. "I have been telling people to say that," he said. "No, you have not," Edgar said. "I have been thinking about it." Edgar shook his hand and then, with the careful formal courtesy of a man who has been waiting to express an opinion about this for some months, he turned to Georgia and said, "Miss Farrow, I speak for the whole of the crew when I say that this is good news." Thomas Birch, who had been hovering at the edge of the yard, shouted something that was not entirely comprehensible but was clearly enthusiastic, and Pete Cassidy appeared from behind the barn and said, with the economy of a man who had seen a great deal of life. Good. Now maybe he will stop riding the fence line for no reason in the evenings. I was checking the fence line for legitimate reasons, Quinn said. The fence on that section, Pete Cassidy said, has not needed checking since Miss Farrow fixed it 6 weeks ago. Georgia caught Quinn's eye and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely undefended, warm and rueful and deeply honest. And she thought that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful that she had walked into Mabel Stokes's general store and accepted a position mending a fence that did not need mending. They were married in June at the Harlow County Church, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by everyone in the county because news traveled fast in small places, and because Quinn Overton was the kind of man whose good fortune people were genuinely glad to witness. Georgia wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had chosen with Mabel Stokes, who cried through the entire ceremony with magnificent unself-consciousness. Edgar stood up with Quinn. The woman who stood with Georgia was Margaret Rue, Samuel's wife, who had come down from Santa Fe for the occasion, and who Georgia had liked immediately, and who was becoming a proper friend, which was itself a kind of miracle. The vows were simple and entirely sincere. When the minister asked if Georgia took Quinn, she said yes clearly and without the slightest hesitation, and the entire congregation seemed to exhale as one. Afterward, there was a reception in the yard of the Mesa Quarter, because it was that kind of community, and there was food that Rosie Birch and 3 other women had spent 2 days preparing, and someone brought a fiddle and someone else had a guitar, and the evening went long and warm under the New Mexico sky with the mesa standing above everything in the pink and then purple light of sunset. Quinn danced with her twice, though he admitted freely that he was not a skilled dancer. She taught him the steps, or tried to. He was teachable, which was a quality she had come to understand was not as common as it should be. "You are stepping on my feet," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I am working on it. You are not working quickly enough." "I spent 9 years building a ranch," he said. "I am a long-term project." She looked up at him, this man who had pulled her out of a burning barn and offered her work when she needed it and love when she was afraid of it. This patient, direct, entirely decent man who was currently standing on her feet in front of most of Harlow County. And she felt something so large and quiet and complete that she had no word for it that did not seem inadequate. "I love you," she said. He stopped pretending to dance. He looked down at her in the warm lamplight with an expression that was unguarded and full and entirely certain. "I know," he said, "and I love you. And I have been waiting to hear you say that out loud for longer than I will probably ever admit." "You could admit it now," she said. "I could," he agreed. "I was thinking of waiting another 6 months or so for balance." She laughed against his shoulder and he held her, and the music went on, and the mesa rose above them in the dark, and the stars came out one by one over the territory. And Georgia Farrow, who had become Georgia Overton that afternoon, stood in the yard of her home and let herself be entirely, unreservedly happy. The summer went on in the way that good summers do, too quickly and fully enough to fill the time completely. Georgia took over the accounts formally and brought them to a state of order that impressed even Edgar, who was not easily impressed by administrative matters. She also began corresponding with Harold Bell about the possibility of providing documented testimony in 2 other cases that Samuel Rue's office was building against business associates of Hardwick's. And Bell wrote that her account had apparently opened a much wider investigation, and that her courage in coming forward had implications that went well beyond the original case. She did not tell Quinn about this correspondence immediately. When she did, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Are you safe?" "Bell believes so," she said. Hardwick's network is being disassembled. The men who might have been motivated to protect his interests are themselves under investigation. Are you going to do it? He asked. I am thinking about it, she said. It is the right thing. I know it is the right thing. I am just, she paused. I am being careful. That is different from before, he said. Before, careful meant not trusting anyone, she said. Now it means thinking before I act. That is the correct version of careful. He nodded. He said, what do you need for me to decide? That was the thing about Quinn. He never offered answers to questions she had not asked. He offered presence and attention, and the specific, practical question of what was needed. She decided to provide the testimony. She sent Belle her account, and it proved useful. And the following spring, Samuel Rue wrote to tell them that 12 additional arrests had been made in Denver in connection with a fraudulent commodities operation that Hardwick had been running for 7 years, and that Georgia's bookkeeping records had been instrumental in building the case. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the cedar box she kept on the top shelf of the bedroom wardrobe, where she was beginning to accumulate the papers of a life that was entirely her own. By autumn of their first year of marriage, she knew she was expecting a child. She told Quinn on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table where they often sat after supper, he with a ledger and she with a letter she was composing. She set down the letter. Quinn. He looked up. We are going to have a child, she said. The expression that crossed his face was one she had never seen on him before, something wide open and unguarded and enormous. And he stood up from the table without appearing to decide to do so, and came around to her, and took her face in his hands, and looked at her for a long moment with everything he felt fully visible. Georgia, he said, you are certain? I am a very precise person, she said. Yes, I am certain. He sat down in the chair beside her, not across the table beside her, and he took her hands and held them and said nothing for a while, and the silence was one of the fullest silences she had ever sat inside. Are you well? He said finally. I am very well, she said. I feel slightly like I have been on a horse for 3 days when I wake up in the morning, but by midday it passes. Tell me what you need, he said. What I need, she said, is to continue doing what I am doing because I am going to go quite peculiar if I am wrapped in cotton wool for 7 months, so I need you to understand that immediately. He looked at her. There was a smile in the back of his eyes. I was not going to wrap you in cotton wool. You were thinking about it. I was thinking about it, he admitted. I will try not to. Try harder, she said, and he laughed. The pregnancy was not easy. She was sick in the mornings through the first months, more consistently than she had anticipated, and there were days when she found the sheer relentlessness of her own body exhausting. Quinn did not wrap her in cotton wool. He adapted. He moved the account books to the kitchen table so she could work sitting close to the stove on cold mornings. He reorganized the supper arrangements without announcing it, so that there was always something available at the cookhouse that she could eat without it making her ill. He asked Margaret Rue, who had 2 children of her own, to come for a week in the 2nd month, ostensibly on other business. But Georgia understood it for what it was, and she was glad. She was enormous by midwinter, which was an indignity she bore with characteristic composure and occasional commentary. I look like a mesa, she said, one evening, catching sight of herself in the mirror on the bedroom wall. You look like someone who is building a person, Quinn said from the doorway. That is a generous interpretation. It is an accurate interpretation, he said, and came into the room and stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, both of them looking at the mirror. And she met his eyes in the reflection, and the expression on his face looking back at her in that mirror was one she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Their son was born in February of 1886, On a cold, clear morning with the mesa bright and white with a rare, overnight snow. The doctor from Harlow County came out the night before when it became clear the birth was imminent, and he was a steady, competent man who Georgia had already decided she trusted, which was not something she decided easily. The labor was long and the hours of it were the hardest hours she had endured since Denver, and Quinn sat beside her through all of it with his hand in hers, and did not leave, and did not tell her it would be fine when he could not know that for certain. And she was grateful beyond expression for the honesty of that. When the baby was finally placed in her arms and she looked down at his small, furious, perfectly formed face, she felt a love so immediate and absolute that it was unlike anything she had ever experienced, which was surprising because she had assumed she would feel something like this, and you could assume all you liked and still not be prepared for the actual fact of it. Quinn stood at the bedside and looked at his son for the first time, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on any person, and she understood that she was watching a man fall entirely in love in a single moment. "Daniel," she said. "I would like to call him Daniel." Quinn looked up at her. His eyes were very bright. "Daniel James Overton," he said. Yes, she had not told him James was his middle name. "James," she said. "My father's name," he said. She looked down at the baby. "Daniel James Overton." She felt the weight of all the names that had gone before, the brother she had loved and lost, the father Quinn had carried inside his own quiet steadiness, and she felt that the name held something true about what she and Quinn were making together, which was not just a life but something that reached backward and forward at the same time. The winter with an infant on the Mesa Quarter was demanding and beautiful and frequently very funny, because Daniel James Overton proved to be an extraordinarily opinionated baby who had clearly inherited his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness, and combined the two into a personal force of nature that kept the entire crew of the ranch in a state of entertained deference. Pete Cassidy, who had seemed immune to most things, became embarrassingly fond of the baby, and could be found on multiple occasions sitting in the cookhouse holding Daniel and talking to him about cattle management. "He is explaining the spring grazing rotation," Thomas Birch told Georgia with great solemnity. "Is the baby taking notes?" Georgia asked. "He seems to be considering it." Quinn, who had spent years being methodical and deliberate about everything, proved to be the kind of father who was entirely willing to abandon methodology the moment his son needed anything, which meant he was frequently up in the night and frequently looking slightly tired and more content than she had ever seen him. "You are going to spoil him," Georgia told him one evening. "I am going to love him well," Quinn said. "There is a difference." She thought about that. She thought about what it was to be loved well, the specific, attentive, patient, daily quality of it. She thought about Quinn in the general store with his hands on the counter saying, "This is something else entirely." And she thought about the gloves and the lumber and the note about the fence. And she thought about a garnet ring in a coat pocket and a dancing lesson that had not gone well. And she thought about her hands in his in the dark after the arrest, and the feel of being held without being constrained. She had spent a long time knowing the cost of loving and not knowing the thing it purchased. She knew it now. "You are thinking very loudly," Quinn said from the other side of the baby, who was asleep between them. "I am thinking that I would like to stay here," she said. "You are here," he said. "I mean in it," she said. "In this, in the specific quality of this thing." She looked across their sleeping son at her husband. "I spent a long time running, and I want to be very clear that I am not running anymore. I am exactly where I intend to be." He looked at her for a long, still, entirely certain moment. "I know," he said. "I know that." In the spring of 1887, Georgia began writing. She had not set out to write anything in particular. She had been keeping a journal since the first months in Harlow County, which was a practical habit she had maintained since she was a girl, a record of events and accounts and observations. But somewhere in the second year after the trial, she began writing about Denver in a different way, not as a record but as an account. The whole of it. What she had witnessed and what she had survived, and the year and a half of running and the final decision to stop. She was not writing it for publication, or not initially. She was writing it because she found that she needed to move the story from the basement of her chest to somewhere outside herself, somewhere it could be looked at in daylight. Quinn read the first section without her asking him to. She had left it on the kitchen table and he read it while she was out at the fence line, and when she came in, he was sitting with the pages in his hands and his expression was something she had not seen before on him. "Georgia," he said. "I know," she said. "This is," he stopped. "It is accurate," she said, sitting down across from him. "It happened the way I described it." "I know it did," he said. "That is not," he set the pages down carefully. "You should publish this. Not for Hardwick, his case is closed, but there are women in your situation. Women who have witnessed something and been told to be silent, or who have been running from something and do not know that stopping is possible." He paused. "This is not a private document, or it should not only be a private document." She looked at the pages. She had not thought of it that way. She began to. "You are good at this," Quinn told her one evening over the letters. "I am good at writing clearly and making sense of things that have happened," she said. "It is the same skill as bookkeeping. You take the events and you put them in the right order and you account for everything." "You are more than that," he said. She thought about that for a long time. By the time Daniel was 2 years old and walking with the determined velocity of someone who had been waiting for this capability for some time, Georgia was corresponding regularly with 2 of the women who had written her, one in Denver and one in Kansas City, and had begun consulting informally with Bell's office on matters that involved financial records and documentation in cases involving fraud. She was building something. She could feel the shape of it, not entirely clearly yet, but there. She was also, in the warm, unhurried way of a life being well lived, very happy. This was a fact she had checked several times because she had learned early not to take good things for granted, and because happiness had a way of being present before she noticed it. But she noticed it now. She noticed it consistently. In the autumn of 1888, when Daniel was 2.5 and had just discovered horses with a single-minded enthusiasm that gave his parents several complicated feelings, Georgia found herself expecting again. She told Quinn on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen with the autumn light coming through the window, and this time she was ready for the look on his face, and it hit her just the same as the first time. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "The horse thing was worse this time, and then it stopped, and now I am simply," she considered. "Large." "You are not large," he said. "Quinn. You are carrying our child," he said. "You are the most. If you say something beautiful right now, I am going to embarrass myself," she said. He stopped. The smile in the back of his eyes was warm and deep and entirely for her. "All right," he said. "You are carrying our child and you look well and I love you, and how is that?" "That is acceptable," she said. And he pulled her gently into his arms and she rested against him in the Sunday morning kitchen of their home, and listened to his heartbeat and the distant sound of Daniel talking extremely seriously to the cat. Their daughter was born in the late spring of 1889, on a warm night with the windows open, and the smell of the blooming mesquite coming through on the breeze. The birth was shorter and kinder than the first, and the baby was large and healthy and magnificently angry about the transition, which Georgia found immediately reassuring. They called her Ellen Margaret Overton. Margaret for Margaret Rue, who had become the particular kind of friend who is also something like family. Ellen because Georgia had always loved the name and had been saving it. Ellen Margaret proved to be, from her earliest weeks, a person of considerable opinions and great physical determination. She and Daniel settled into a sibling dynamic that was immediately evident. Daniel was methodical and observant, much like his father, and Ellen was immediate and forceful, and had her mother's precision applied to entirely her own purposes, and they were consequently devoted to each other in the way of people who are sufficiently different that they are endlessly interesting. Quinn watched his children with a quality of attention that Georgia recognized from the way he had first watched her. That direct, patient, genuinely interested attention that was his fundamental nature. And seeing it turned on their children filled her with a warmth she had no adequate language for except love, which was a word she had come to understand was larger on the inside than it appeared from the outside. The Mesa quarter grew. By 1890, they were running 6,000 acres, and Quinn had taken on 3 more hands and a second foreman who helped Edgar manage the expanded operation. Georgia's accounts kept the business as tight and transparent as any in the territory, and she had a reputation among the neighboring ranchers for financial precision that occasionally made men uncomfortable, which she found she did not mind at all. Her writing continued. She published 2 more accounts, one in a Denver women's journal and one in a nationally distributed periodical, and she had become a person that other women sought out when they needed help navigating situations that were legal in nature and required careful documentation, and she found that she had built something after all. Something that was entirely hers and also entirely part of the life she shared with Quinn and the children and the ranch and the wide, beautiful, demanding country around it. There was an evening in the autumn of 1890 when Daniel was 4 and Ellen was a year old, and the harvest was done, and the air had that sharp, clean coolness that meant winter was considering arriving. Georgia and Quinn sat on the porch of the main house after the children were in bed, the way they often sat, with the last of the evening light on the mesa and the first of the stars coming out above it. Quinn was not saying much, which was not unusual, and Georgia was thinking about a letter she needed to write to Harold Bell about a documentation question in the Kansas City correspondence, which was also not unusual. "Quinn," she said. He said. "Do you remember what you said to me in the general store that first time?" He thought for a moment. "I said it was not pity." "And I said I did not want your pity," she said, "and I said good." "And you said, 'This is love,'" he said. She turned to look at him in the last of the evening light. He was sitting with his forearms on the porch rail, looking at the mesa, and then he turned to look at her, and his face in the copper light was the face of the man she had built a life with, changed by time and familiar in every particular, and the thing she had been afraid to look at directly that first year was the thing she had been looking at every day since. "You were very certain," she said. "I was nowhere near ready and you were entirely certain." "I knew what it was," he said simply. "I have known what things are when I have seen them. It is one of the things I am good at." "It is," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Are you happy, Georgia?" She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about the cedar box of papers on the top shelf of the wardrobe, growing full with the documents of a life. She thought about Daniel talking to the cat and Ellen's fierce, immediate laugh, and the way the ranch smelled in the early morning before anyone else was up. She thought about Harold Bell and Margaret Rue and Edgar standing in the yard saying, "About time," and Mabel Stokes crying through the wedding ceremony, and Pete Cassidy explaining the spring grazing rotation to an infant. She thought about running and stopping, and the specific quality of being entirely where you intended to be. "Yes," she said, "completely." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the porch of their home as the sky darkened to deep blue above the mesa, and the stars came out clear and bright over the territory, and the wind moved through the mesquite with the smell of the good season, and the lamplight in the windows behind them made the house look exactly like what it was. Something built, something that held,